And now on Nights with Steve Price from the 50UP Club, Christopher Zinn.
Chris joins us. How are you?
I'm very well. A bit croaky in the voice, but otherwise very well. And, of course, I've just learned as a cohort how well off we are financially in other ways, so there should be no reason for complaining.
As the chief baby boomer, I'm getting increasingly annoyed at people always slagging off at our generation, saying you've had it so easy. It's, you guys have got houses. We're never going to be able to afford a house. It just really does annoy me. I mean, no one ever says how hard we worked to get what we got in the first place.
Exactly. I mean, that is something that statistics can't really easily reflect. And while more wealth does accrue for those who are older, I mean, look, part of that has to do with something that was, out of their control, i.e. that there was a huge escalation of house prices while they were in property. But also, as you've said, those were people who either by luck or judgment, decided to invest in housing at a time were able to do it. And there were very high interest rates and there were difficulties and they didn't all move into penthouse apartments from the get-go.
I started work at the age of 17. I don't want the violins to be brought out here, but I started work at 17 and have worked every day since.
Yeah, well, look, housing is such an interesting issue about, who's in what and where it is and what it's worth and what they got for it. And again, it is very emotional. I suppose that's what's interesting in terms of the data we've had out this week, which is, the household income from the University of Melbourne, which has really put this issue on the forefront in terms of, as I said, some of the 80% of homes headed by people over 65 are owner-occupied. Whereas for 25 to 34-year-olds, it's about 47%. Perhaps not surprising, but, household ownership and household wealth does tend to be concentrated in those older. Not all of them, of course, but a fair proportion.
So these stats are interesting. On an individual level, 52% of people over 18 now own a home. That's always a misnomer anyway. What that really should say is 52% of people aged over the age of 18 either are paying off a home to the bank or some own their own home. That's down from 57% in 2002. That's not such a drop, is it?
It's not, but I suppose if you look at the trends, and while there are, and what the researchers say, this is due to affordability issues. It's not so to do with preferences. So there's been an argument that actually young people prefer, or younger families prefer to live nearer the city, prefer to live in apartments, don't have the same desire for home ownership as before. But this research seems to suggest that it was really driven by issues of affordability, squeezing them out of the market.
So what are we going to do about this issue of housing affordability? I mean, you've got record low interest rates. Unemployment rate is not particularly high. The only way that I can see that you can solve this issue is greater land release by state governments, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, or you encourage people and businesses to relocate to regional and rural Australia where property's cheap. And if you're going to do that, what governments have to do is get off their backsides and build fast, reliable transport to get to and from work.
Yeah, and look, that's a key issue. It's not just, Australia and New South Wales are much more concentrated than other states and other countries, and I think that particularly makes it an issue here. But there is a level of investment and vision and leadership around that I'm afraid one does find generally wanting. But yeah, what can you do? I mean, there are issues in terms of increasing the supply through land release, reducing the demand by putting added imposts through stamp duties onto foreign investors and whatever, negative gearings in that mix as well. But again, as soon as government intervention, we've had first homeowner grants of one kind or another at state and federal level, really ineffective apart from pushing up the price. So they don't, often in the most well-meaning of things, do not have an impact on affordability.
We'd just been through an election campaign. I don't remember any of this being a particularly strong election debate. We had 8 weeks of talking about the future of the country. Where was the discussion about how we unlock perhaps the wealth that's locked up in some of these properties occupied by older Australians, if they want to unlock it, so that they can perhaps help their children and grandchildren get into the market themselves? That's another debate we have to have.
Exactly, and there's been various sort of policy ideas about improving the reverse mortgage market, and those are ways where people can unlock the equity. But again, as Chris Bowen, the Shadow Treasurer, said, a lot of the policy settings are in fact wrong, and people stay put in their places. And there's some work we've done at the 50Up Club in terms of that middle ring of suburbs with houses, because younger people who have families want to have houses with gardens. They don't necessarily want to live in flats. It's just older people who are staying there, often in properties that are too large for their general purposes. But in terms of the transaction cost of stamp duties and various other policies, it doesn't actually, such as the age pension, it doesn't actually make sense for them to move. They're much better off to stay put.
But maybe we've reached the point in Australian history, Christopher, where the idea that everybody has a house with a backyard and a front fence is finished. Clearly, a lot more people are living closer to the cities and living in apartments. But if you look at comparable sized cities in the rest of the world, many people never, ever even contemplate having home ownership. They rent for life.
They do, and I mean, particularly in the European context, which I know a bit better, often that's because tenants have much better rights in terms of how long that they have it, the rights they have as tenants, the increase, whatever. So tenancies and rental is actually much more attractive prospect than it is in Australia. But again, we're meant to have this great myth of home ownership, but perhaps, it's wearing thin, and affordability is one part of that. Certainly what can actually be done in the short term. Lots of people will come up with solutions, but really, I suppose if you look back and see the ones that actually worked, you'd be digging hard to find them.
All right, well, the debate will continue now that we have the government back with a slim majority. We are going to have to continue to debate these issues. I think state governments have got to start to think sensibly about how they do get people into housing, if that's what they want to do. And the ideas that I've suggested, perhaps they need to start talking about it. Christopher Zinn from the 50Up Club, always a pleasure. Thank you, mate.